We'll start with introductions and I'll kick off. So hi, everybody. My name is Chris. I am the Director of Client Solutions and Growth for Helix's business in Asia. I'm actually based in Kuala Lumpur. Today, obviously, we'll be walking through the APAC Risk Radar webinar. We're very happy to share this information with you. Thankfully for me, I won't be doing most of the heavy lifting. I'm joined by three of my colleagues, also in the APAC region. So we have Tom Baker. Tom oversees our APAC security function, having previously served in the British Army. Tom also grew up in the Middle East, which obviously has direct relevance to some of the content we'll be talking about today. Tom drives our security assistance approach. He directs crisis response. He's directly involved in everything we've been doing in response to the Middle East. We're also joined by Michael Gardiner. Michael sits in Melbourne as well. Michael is a security analyst on our team, so he's been extremely busy monitoring, assessing, analyzing what's been taking place in the Middle East, but relevant to the risk radar. He contributed heavily to the content that we'll be going through beyond just the crisis in the Middle East. Lastly, we have Ronnie Lug, a security coordinator. She joined Helix last year. She works very closely to our operational picture. She helps deliver global risk support and is involved in crisis assistance. So just to set the stage before we get into it. Now, as we all know, we all have access to what seems like infinite sources of information, which is often conflicting, particularly in the social media age. So it's not really an access or a volume issue in terms of information. There's no shortage of information. What there is a shortage of clarity. So the risk radar is designed to help provide signal within that noise. It's our goal as a team to try to highlight the risks that we believe actually matter for you, for the organizations, and for the people that are operating in the region. Now, it's also really important to point out the risk radar is not designed to be a static snapshot of the risks as they sit today. As we're seeing with the Middle East, situations are fluid, they're dynamic, they're constantly evolving. So the risk radar is also a forward-looking view of where we think the disruption is heading. So all of us can plan and prepare for what's coming next. Now, we published the risk radar in late 2025. We talked about everything from geopolitical tension to pressure on supply chains. But first and foremost, I believe we made a broader point, which is that risks do not sit in silos. Political risk, medical risk, security risk, travel risk, financial and liability risk, these things are not static. Actually, they overlap, they intersect, and they're often self-reinforcing. The conflict in the Middle East is pointing exactly to that. It's not just a regional issue. Out here in APAC, it's impacting fuel prices, inflation, air travel, even how governments are responding domestically. Just this week alone, the Indonesian and the Filipino government have been talking about a potential crisis as it relates to fuel shortage. So at the same time, obviously, nobody's been hitting the pause button on natural disasters, which are also potentially impacting supply chains. So again, the theme today is quite simple. It's the convergence of all of these risks that I just outlined. So we're going to go through what we're seeing on the ground, what's changed since the start of the year, and most importantly, what this means for organizations operating in APAC. So, Tom, I'm going to start with you. Obviously, I think it'd be entirely tone deaf if we didn't at least start with the conflict in the Middle East. Our teams have been completely inundated with requests. We've been extremely busy. So could you please talk us through the operational reality, what you've been managing day to day, and some of the challenges therein?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And you're right, definitely makes sense to start with the Middle East. The last 4 weeks have been incredibly busy for our teams. So the conflict has shaped almost everything that our teams have dealt with over the last couple of weeks. And nowhere has that felt more sharply than across the Gulf. So just a bit of context, I'm sure everyone knows. So 28th of February, the US and the Israelis launched a joint operation against Iran. Tehran, in response, launched widespread retaliatory attacks right across the Gulf, hitting airports, US bases, major energy sites across the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Saudi. Facilities like refineries, LNG plants, and export terminals have been damaged or forced offline. And probably most pertinent to business travel is that airspace closures were happening in real time as falling debris and interception activity made flying unsafe across the region. So that's the context of what we've been operating in. So it was a region-wide shock where the situation was evolving minute by minute. So from a global security operations center perspective, so we have a GSOC here in Melbourne, and we work very closely with our fellow GSOCs in the Americas and in Europe, and the operational tempo immediately shifted into a full 24/7 crisis posture. Our teams have been working in rotation, so that intelligence, operations, logistics, and medical support all stay live around the clock. We were dealing with a whole host of inquiries from clients who had travelers stranded in the Gulf as the airspace was closed. And we were monitoring strike patterns, airspace restrictions, maritime closures, and also the disruption to ground level operations, particularly in the border areas between the various Gulf states. So we were running evacuations overland from the Gulf states to either Riyadh or Muscat, respectively, where airspace was a bit more permissive. And in addition to running the evacuations, we were also providing up-to-date real-time intelligence to our clients in the region, which was particularly important as there was a whole host of disinformation and misinformation spread on social media, particularly in the first few days of the crisis. So ground evacuations have played a big role over the last couple of weeks. We've had to activate land movement contingencies at speeds. So we've been validating various routes and alternative routes, rechecking them, making sure the border's permissive. One thing that was particularly pertinent in this situation was the various visas that travelers needed to obtain to get into Saudi or get into Oman from the UAE or from the other Gulf states. So we were helping our clients along that with the process and recommending the best course of action, really. And there's been a lot of triaging various cases. I mean, we've actually dealt with some particularly complex ground moves. One in particular was from a client in Baghdad, which we decided the best course of action was to move them overland through the north of the country, over the border with Turkey. And this was in the first 24 hours of the retaliatory strikes. And we took the decision and did the risk analysis of sheltering in place versus overland movements. And in that case, we determined it was more important to get them on the move and get them over into a safe territory. Notwithstanding that we weren't sure how the various militant groups in Iraq were going to respond, particularly those that were Iranian aligned. So we've dealt with a lot of cases over the last couple of weeks. It's been very busy, but as you said, this isn't a region-confined conflict, and the repercussions have been felt all over, particularly in APAC.
Yeah, so just maybe kind of running with that thread, it's not confined to the region. For someone like myself who's sitting in Asia, I guess you could feel that geographic distance creates a risk buffer, but that's obviously not the case. Michael, if I could ask you to jump in, how would you say the conflict in the Middle East has potentially shifted the risk environment out here in Asia? And what are some of the other broader implications that you're seeing?
Yeah, cheers, Chris, and kia ora, everyone. I think we've seen, and I agree, that APAC certainly isn't immune to recent developments in the Middle East. The effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz has caused significant global disruption to fuel supplies. It's raised business costs quite significantly. So 80% or so of the Strait's oil supplies are bound for Asia. So it underscores its status as a critical node for Asian supply chains. Some countries have reached agreements with Iran that allow for the transit of these fuel supplies. China, for example, has been a primary benefactor so far, which makes sense given its reasonably cooperative historic relationship with Tehran. Japan and Thailand have reached similar agreements. In fact, a Thai tanker came through the Strait of Hormuz yesterday, by the looks of it, with the Iranian government's consent. That's pretty consistent so far with Iran's greater leniency towards perceived so-called non-hostile nations. APAC countries in general have been unevenly impacted, I would say. For most, the main risks for now are still primarily increased fuel prices and inflationary pressures rather than outright shortages. But that's not to say some haven't struggled already. So some regional governments in South and Southeast Asia in particular have introduced more punitive measures, I would say, to kind of control fuel prices and supply. For example, mandated work from home policies for government officials, or the introduction of kind of quota systems at fuel stations via QR codes or some other measure. In terms of kind of wider grievances related to the conflict, they're likely to continue to drive an uptick, I suppose, in public agitation and protest activity throughout the APAC region. Turnouts can vary depending on the location, but they can be well attended and increase the risk of localized disruption in your areas of operation. The majority do occur peacefully and pose relatively low security risks to bystanders. However, the fatal unrest we saw in Pakistan in early March, particularly the US consulate in Karachi, it does demonstrate the potential for violence in some areas. Of course, of importance to regional governments, I suppose, is it'll be managing the fallout of these rising costs and the availability of supply issues caused by the conflict, particularly over fuel. So we've seen that in the Philippines, which recently declared a national emergency. We've also seen transport stoppages from prominent unions over the past week or so, and that does demonstrate that segments of society will be driven to protest, particularly in countries more recently affected by cost of living pressures. So this additional economic pressure caused by the conflict and the closure of the strait could prompt further or maybe a rekindling of anti-government unrest and political instability in some countries, placing even further pressure on supply chains. And I think finally, just to touch on external conflict risks, while low, Iran is gradually expanding the list of what it considers to be legitimate targets within the Middle East. The main concern for APAC is if that list kind of expands geographically, and that's, to be fair, true of both Iranian and US-Israeli strike patterns. So there's already precedent to suggest the conflict scope has expanded into APAC to some degree. The US targeted an Iranian warship, Dena, off the coast of Sri Lanka in early March. And even in recent days, the Diego Garcia military base in the Indian Ocean was reportedly targeted by Iranian missiles. So while APAC countries are highly unlikely to be directly impacted by these external conflict risks, I'd say these recent incidents do highlight the growing risk of overspill and how, as you point out, this probably won't be contained.
So, Michael, thanks for covering that. Now, obviously, what you're talking to is that there's a risk spectrum. There's all sorts of variables playing into an event like this. We did a webinar 2 days ago with over 600 registrants of mobility leaders across Asia. And a lot of the questions coming in to our operational desk and even on webinars like that are not just about the obvious security risks, the direct impact, physical safety risks, but also on more practical implications around things like travel disruptions, questions like, I'm traveling through Europe and I may route through the Middle East. Should I be canceling my trip? So Ronnie, if I could turn to you and ask you, not just from a safety perspective, but also from a practical travel perspective, what are we seeing in terms of disruption there, and what should our clients be planning for as they try to continue on with business travel?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So it's obviously completely understandable that people are wanting to know what the operational and travel risks are that are arising as the conflict moves into the end of its fourth week. We're beginning to see significant disruptions across the APAC aviation sector, particularly as the conflict drives fuel prices sharply upwards and as it continues to restrict access to key airspace corridors. So major air carriers in the region are now adjusting schedules, cancelling flights and consolidating their operational services in response to these pressures. The recently announced reduction in Air New Zealand flights to the Pacific Islands is an indicator of this disruption, which is likely to be felt latently across the region. Numerous other carriers, such as Jetstar and Malaysia Airlines, have also indicated that they're considering or preparing for schedule reductions, and remaining flight services are also expected to see price rises consistent with what we're seeing globally, with carriers struggling to service the pressure of normal flight schedules while battling to keep their fuel prices down and operating costs low. In what seems like a pretty stark contrast to this, the disruption to travel via key aviation hubs for Middle Eastern routes such as Doha and Dubai have also led to a surge in air travel routing through major transit hubs in the Asia Pacific, such as Singapore, Kuala Lumpur, and Hong Kong. So while this boost comes amid increasing operational costs for long-haul and domestic flights, it has also led to airlines such as Singapore Airlines and Cathay Pacific scaling up their operations in order to meet the demand for alternate stopover destinations, and while options for travellers remain heavily restricted. So as travellers continue to seek alternate routes that bypass the Middle East's key transit hubs, airlines with the capacity to expand their long-haul flight offerings are expected to continue scaling up their operations in order to meet the demands of business-as-usual movements, particularly between Asia and European hubs, while this conflict continues and blocks off those key destinations. A key example of this within the Asia-Pacific region comes from Singapore Airlines, who have recently added additional routes to key business and tourist spots, such as London's Heathrow and Gatwick airports and Frankfurt in Germany. In addition to this, it's supplementing their previous flight offerings while the demand is heightened and other options remain limited. So while the situation is continuing to evolve, the trend is pretty clear that the Middle East conflict is reshaping how the flight availability across the Asia-Pacific region is, with carriers taking increasingly proactive measures to maintain their operational stability throughout these volatile conditions. For companies looking to maintain the business continuity throughout this, if they haven't already, they should start reviewing business models for at least the short term to consider alternate arrangements for non-essential travel, just in order to manage these operational disruptions and limit exposure to the inflated air travel expenses.
Perfect. Okay, thanks, Ronnie. So what I would like to do for a moment is to just step back and anchor things into a case that I was personally involved in. I think it's very important not just to talk about risk theoretically or what we're reading in the news, but also to anchor this into real life situations. And this is particularly a case I wanted to share because it shows the convergence of medical and security risk and what can happen when you have a flood of misinformation at the same time. So in 2016, I was based in Jakarta, and there was a terrorist attack in central Jakarta, initially targeting a police post. So you had an assailant with assault rifles, they had explosives. Now the attack ended up spreading beyond that. They threw a grenade into a Starbucks. Now that attack took place outside the United Nations Department of Safety and Security. I actually had a meeting that morning in the building that thankfully was canceled. Unfortunately, when that grenade was thrown into the Starbucks, a UN worker was in line there, and he was very, very gravely injured. Now, fortunately for him, two of his colleagues who were there nearby, they had been trained in first aid, so they managed to stabilize him, which ultimately, as I'll talk about in a moment, ended up setting the stage and saved his life. So while that is taking place, a security incident is unfolding. I had another client in the building who called me. I could hear machine gun fire going off in the background, routed him to the security team. So here you have a medical component, an unfolding security situation. And then at the exact same time, in parallel, a flood of misinformation started being propagated on social media. Reports started coming in that there were additional attacks taking place around the city. They were saying that there were assailants on the back of motorcycles with assault rifles driving around shooting indiscriminately into the crowd. There were reports of explosives going off on Universitas Indonesia, it's a national university. And at that point, a lot of calls started coming in. People were panicking. Our advice was shelter in place, stay where you are. Often the risk exposure increases as you're trying to move locations, and a panic. Until we could ascertain what was actually going on, stay in place. Now, as it turned out, that information was all being propagated by people involved with the attack to sow further confusion and chaos. There were no additional attacks taking place. The Indonesian authorities managed to eventually neutralize the situation. And then we worked on a very complex international medical evacuation with an air ambulance. The man was in a coma. Thankfully, he ultimately survived. So when you talk about a case like that, the reason I share it, not only was I personally involved, but it shows in these types of complex situations, you have a convergence of risk. And just as we've seen in the Middle East, many people calling in heightened anxiety, heightened panic, trying to get access to information. What I said in the beginning of today's session was the signal within the noise. Quite often, having access to expert advice, opinion, and information goes a long way to mitigating your personal risk. So Mikey, I want to bring this back to you. What would you say the wider terrorism risk is looking like across the region right now? We've obviously seen a history in parts of Asia of radicalized elements. So what would you say that risk is, and how is the conflict in the Middle East influencing the other types of threats that we may potentially see?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think in terms of the regional terrorism risk, it's slightly increased due to the Middle East conflict. We've seen in the past tensions and conflict in the Middle East have previously acted as drivers for radicalization, extremist activity, and that's shown by even in recent months spikes in anti-Semitic and Islamophobic incidents, for example. So place of worship are possible targets if it's a more kind of religiously motivated attack, as well as any sort of in particular, US, Israeli, or Iranian sites like consulates or embassies. However, it is worth noting no countries in the region have upgraded their terrorism threat levels so far, at least since the conflict commenced, which does suggest an attack in APAC isn't imminent, but it does still remain a possibility. Ultimately, lone wolf attacks with unsophisticated, usually readily available weapons, they remain the most likely type of attack to impact most countries in the region. They don't necessarily need to follow a clear ideology, such as far right or Islamist extremism. The latter, for example, is a key one in the case of the Bondi Beach terrorist attack, for example. You often have mixed, unclear, unstable extremism remaining a concern for security agencies as well, particularly when it takes the form of lone wolf attacks on soft targets. So, for example, major events like maybe a Taylor Swift concert, or actually a better example is the BTS comeback concert in Seoul last week with a huge attendance. Those are possible soft targets that prompt heightened security measures from the local authorities. The bombing of some other recent examples, the bombing of the mosque inside a school in North Jakarta, to come back to Indonesia, that occurred in November. That was allegedly committed by a minor, again with an unclear motive, although interestingly there were some kind of far-right extremist elements to the alleged perpetrator's thought. There was also the mass casualty stabbing attack in Taipei in December. That was similarly conducted by a perpetrator without a clear ideological intent. So these type of attacks in general are extremely difficult to predict and prepare for, and that's even in societies with advanced counterterrorism capabilities. To bring into South Asia, the example of the Islamabad mosque bombing in February, that killed at least 36 people, injured 150 others. Islamic State ended up claiming responsibility for that one. And the important thing to note, I think, in the context of South Asia is these type of attacks can have wider implications, including for external conflict risks. So last year, the 2025 Pahalgam attack in India-administered Jammu and Kashmir prompted a rapid deterioration in the India-Pakistan relationship, which later informed the suspension of the Indus Waters Treaty. It prompted regional disruption, as well as, of course, the brief military conflict that we saw between the two nuclear-armed rivals. And again, I think almost to some extent, regardless of ideology, but to come back to your point, Chris, on this sort of kind of general motivations, they are usually designed, I think, these type of attacks to cause significant casualties and ultimately capitalize on fear. And I think what you touched on in terms of the initial chaos is important. Often from the outset, these type of attacks tend to cause widespread panic, confusion. It generates a lot of noise, and it significantly compromises the reliability of incoming initial information. So Bondi is a prime example where emerging reports came through, for example, of other attacks in nearby suburbs, which sowed even further fear of a coordinated attack and created difficulties for the overall police response. So I think what that highlights is the importance of having these sort of crisis management plans in place, as well as having an intelligence component or a verification component to kind of sift through the noise, the misinformation, and ultimately ensure that personnel can be quickly informed and protected when events like this occur.
Exactly. Again, that ties back to what I've been saying throughout, finding the signal in the noise. So Tom, let me come back to you. Beyond just kind of imminent, immediate potential security risk, at a broader level, at a macro level, we're seeing a potential change in geopolitical influence in APAC, how that pertains to the United States influence. Maybe you could talk us through that, what you're seeing, potential changes and the implications of that as well.
Yeah, Chris, it's been really interesting to watch over the last couple of weeks, and I think to understand how this conflict is reshaping the geopolitical balance in APAC, we need to start with the simple reality that Washington's attention is being pulled sharply towards the Middle East. So the scale of US military operations, from deploying fleets and troops and the reallocation of air defense, it means that significant strategic bandwidth is being diverted away from Asia Pacific, which has been really interesting. So the shift reinforces doubts that have been building for years about the reliability of US commitment in the region. I think confidence in Washington has already waned as China has become more assertive and increasingly willing to redefine geopolitical relationships across Asia Pacific. Beijing would definitely view this conflict as an opportunity, as it can cast the US as an overstretched and an even irresponsible power, distracted by simultaneous crises in the Middle East and elsewhere in the Western Hemisphere. Venezuela would be a good example of that, or what's happening in Cuba currently. So while that's going on and the US are distracted, China can position itself as that steady, reliable advocate of rules-based international order, which has been a really interesting change. So obviously it's still a bit too early to tell at this point, but this is something we're watching. I can imagine in the future more trade agreements, particularly with Southeast Asian states, between them and China coming to fruition. I think you can see the hand of Beijing extending across the region a bit more. I think the Trump administration's recent strategic behavior has amplified the concerns. And over the past several months, so the White House has dedicated enormous attention and resources to consolidating US influence in the Middle East. This has reinforced that perception across Asia Pacific that the pivot over to this region is no longer the strategic priority that it once was over the last couple of years. And as I said, it comes at precisely the moment where China's intensifying military pressure and diplomatic outreach across the region. And we've already seen that the practical signs of strain. So a lot of the key weapon systems, in particular air defense, has been reallocated from South Korea and Japan over to the Gulf. I think this is what's going to be really interesting to see is how Asian powers view the presence of the US military in particular within their states. So the Gulf traditionally has relied upon US presence as that security guarantee, and I think after the last couple of weeks, it's highlighted that the presence of US bases could be more of a liability in the form of targets rather than security assets. So it's going to be one to watch over particularly the next couple of months in the short term.
Yeah, even on a personal front, having grown up in Asia, I have seen that transition that you're talking about, the shifting of influence, and China having the One Belt, One Road initiative for many years, financing infrastructure projects, China being the leading trade partner for hundreds of countries around the world, it is interesting to see that dynamic change. So, Ronnie, if I could ask you to jump in as well, just piggybacking on what Tom said, as that influence shifts and wanes, how would you see the conflict taking place today, potentially reshaping some of these alliances in APAC, historically strong alliances like with Japan? And how could that potentially impact things with China and the Taiwan Strait?
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and Tom as well, leading on from you. So we know that alliances and pressure points throughout the region have historically been very fluid, with countries opting for alliances that benefit them both in a security realm, but as well as trade and infrastructure agreements. So two key players of this have notoriously been the US and China, often vying for the same partnerships. As we see the US priorities sort of shift slightly away from the region, countries have been regularly moving to protect their own interests, especially as the competition around China, Japan, and the Taiwan Strait becomes sharper. And as I said, US priorities sort of shift to engagements closer to home. This has significant implications for travellers and businesses who are looking to operate within the region, as it sort of all drips into people wanting to transit through different countries. So amid this change in US strategy and priorities, China has been notably expanding its influence and footprint within the Pacific, using investments and security ties to deepen its influence. These primary sources of investment, as you said, come through the Belt and Road Initiative, port and network infrastructure, policing and security partnerships. So the perceptions of reduced reliability among historical aid nations like the US and China's increased willingness to invest have really heavily swayed these relationships. This was particularly significant in the case of the Solomon Islands, which we saw sort of shift towards a more China-aligned stance in past years. But several nations have also sought to realign their alliances to ensure that their development opportunities remain adequately funded while Western priorities shift, ebb and flow. This doesn't exclude other regional partners like Australia, which has steadily been widening its regional partnerships, particularly through defence and security arrangements. We saw that they recently signed a security agreement with Papua New Guinea just to exemplify this. However, as you brought up, the Taiwan Strait still remains one of the most sensitive flashpoints in the region. Throughout 2025 and into 2026, China has continued applying the hybrid pressure that they are known for, including frequent airspace incursions, cyber operations which target government networks and critical infrastructure, and disinformation campaigns that work to amplify these political fault lines, which intensify the sense of risk among the regional governments. The cross-strait tensions have also started to spill into regional diplomacy, as we saw with relations between China and Japan taking a pretty noticeable downturn since November in 2025. This came following the Japanese Prime Minister suggesting that Japan might step in militarily if China were to move on Taiwan, as it would pose a direct threat to Japan. We saw Beijing push back with a range of diplomatic, economic and security responses, which range from cutting commercial flights, issuing travel warnings and cancelling cultural exchanges. And I think nothing demonstrates the extent to which this dispute has persisted more than the withdrawal of China's 2 lone pandas from Japanese zoos in January of this year. So with neither side taking too much interest in backing down, the situation is likely to stay tense as we continue into 2026 and beyond. But panda politics and diplomatic tensions aside, I think one of the biggest shifts in modern conflict that we've seen sort of through this isn't so much a return to the traditional battlefield fighting, it's been the growing acceptance of constant low-level pressures, which never quite cross into open war or direct engagement. So China's behaviour around Taiwan has been a clear example of this. We've seen large air and naval drills used to rehearse encirclement and test Taiwan's defences regularly. But at the same time, we've seen China apply steady pressure through repeated airspace incursions, the cyber attacks I previously mentioned, and disinformation campaigns. None of these actions on their own justify a full-scale response, but taken together, they do slowly reshape the strategic environment, which help Beijing to advance its goals through the sustained cumulative pressure. And these grey zone tactics do have direct implications for travellers, with device and information security becoming an increasing concern for those travelling outside of their home country amid the more frequent low-scale cyber attacks. The considerations continue beyond China and into other countries in the region, and with an ever-growing list of the risks and regulations to be aware of, this is really something that businesses should be prioritising to remain informed of the digital security landscape in order to protect their private data, but just as well as the company reputation and avoid any legal incidents while trying to travel. In terms of security solutions for travellers, it's heavily case dependent, but this can be as simple as utilising a VPN while away from personal or known private networks.
Yeah, you talk about shifting strategic political dynamics. You mentioned Japan. Japan is also known for, unfortunately, having been home to quite a few natural disasters, not just Japan. Big parts of the Asia Pacific sit along the Ring of Fire. And so I think it's easy to focus on the conflict in the Middle East. It's obviously first and foremost in the forefront of risk assessment. However, we can't forget about the threat of natural disasters. We are seeing increasingly severe weather events. You do have large typhoons in the Philippines, flood risk in Malaysia as examples. So Mikey, if we can shift a little bit, focusing on the implications of natural disasters, how would you suggest businesses could best prepare for natural disaster risks, given their prominence in the region historically?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree. It's definitely important not to disregard the significant impacts of natural disasters in the region. In fact, climate and environmental disruption ranked second overall, I believe, among the surveyed risk managers in terms of long-term risks in our risk radar. Even right now, just a quick canvass of the region this morning, we've got a deep tropical low causing flooding and disruption in New Zealand's upper North Island as we speak. On Tuesday, I think it was, we had the magnitude 7.6 earthquake near Tonga, demonstrating the seismic risks around the Ring of Fire. We've got a tropical cyclone Narelle that's re-intensified in the northern part of Western Australia in the past 24 hours. So that looks to be the first cyclone in over 2 decades to hit 3 states or territories in Australia. Typhoons, of course, expected in the coming months. I think Hong Kong announced the other day they're expecting around 4 to 7 typhoons to impact the territory. And you're right, it's a concern because ultimately storm systems are becoming increasingly severe due to global warming, alongside heat waves and rising temperatures, which we saw throughout East Asia for consecutive weeks at the midpoint of last year. I think to kind of highlight how to prepare, I think a good example is the flooding in Southeast Asia in late 2025 demonstrated the importance of natural disaster preparedness. So we conducted multiple evacuations out of Hat Yai, which is a popular tourist destination, southern Thailand. And that followed devastating monsoonal flooding in around November. So we were, from the intelligence side, worked closely with coordinators and on-the-ground providers to plan around the adverse weather, the flooding, compromised roads and airport access as well, disorganized disaster relief efforts, supply shortages, communications outages, you name it, even government mandates. And ultimately, the idea of that was to maintain strong situational awareness and assist with supplying or potentially evacuating personnel out of Hat Yai at the time. It demonstrates really that I think organizations need to be prepared to support employees by regularly monitoring those local risk environments and assessing those natural disaster risks, particularly ones you can kind of foresee, like the seasonal extreme weather that can cause rapid deteriorations. And it also highlights that having those kind of incident response and evacuation plans ready to be activated at short notice is critical in keeping people safe in that regard.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a subset of natural disaster risk, and that is man-made, such as the deforestation that takes place in Kalimantan, the fires and the smoke that often inundates countries like Singapore, increasing health risk because of the particulate matter. So it's a real thing that takes place in the region, and risk managers need to be mindful of. Now, natural disasters can also impact supply chains, as we have also seen the conflict in the Middle East impacting supply chains, which is in turn putting pressure on regional governments. Domestically, we've seen all sorts of agitation amongst local populations and even in countries like Nepal and Indonesia. So Ronnie, if I could get your input here, how likely is it that more of these types of domestic protests and forms of unrest are going to continue to form in 2026?
Thanks, Chris. So yeah, you're right. We're seeing supply chains across the whole Asia Pacific region face mounting pressure from multiple directions. Unfortunately, this pressure has only escalated since the beginning of 2026, partially due to the conflict in the Middle East, but also just due to political instability, social unrest, and broader geopolitical shifts, which are just continuing to weaken the resiliency of business networks and routinely create new issues that need to be managed. Several countries spent large parts of 2025 grappling with major anti-government protests, which temporarily brought daily life and business activity to a halt. Concerns about corruption and weak governance do continue to sit just below the surface, and there's still major triggers for unrest in a number of places, particularly throughout South and Southeast Asia. Notably, we saw increased national identities play a key role in inspiring a lot of this unrest, feeding into the street-level energy of the protests. So, in Indonesia, public frustration over elite privilege and governance failures helped to fuel widespread anti-government demonstrations. And in Nepal, similar outcry against Nepo kids and a ban on social media platforms helped to ignite massive youth-led protests, which culminated in the burning of parliament in Kathmandu and a national security crisis. The Gen Z movements across South and Southeast Asia reimagined nationalism as a push for accountability and fairness rather than just direct state loyalty. And these demands equally drew from a belief that defending progress meant addressing corruption and political privilege head on. So, for supply chains, the impact of this protest activity, even the smaller repeat demonstrations, can be huge. Instability and demonstrations can shut down facilities, they block key transport routes, delay shipments, and just ultimately have potential to drive up cost. So while the intensity of protests has dropped off for now, the risk has not disappeared, and any spike in public frustration, whether it's about government decisions, corruption, inequality, or just heavy-handed leadership, can quickly cause these tensions to flare again. We're already seeing a number of protests pop up in relation to the ongoing conflict in the Middle East, and it is possible that these do escalate further. The disruption in 2025 made travel and in-country operations especially challenging, as was reflected within the risk radar. Governments responded to immediate flashpoints, but the deeper structural issues continue to remain largely unaddressed. Protests of all sizes remain really common events, and they should be highlighted to businesses for just how fragile political stability remains in the region. As a result, organisations should be increasingly exploring their strategies of de-risking and realigning supply chains and partnerships to avoid a reliance on a single point of failure. Looking ahead as we move through into the first few months of 2026, these lingering concerns about governance and corruption mean that further unrest, especially in those major cities, should remain very much on the radar for all businesses.
Perfect. Thanks, Ronnie. Look, it's a complicated world we live in, and as I said in the opening, a lot of times these risks are reinforcing. There's a lot of variables at play here, but again, it's not all doom and gloom. So I do want to kind of drop the last question. I want to save time for Q&A. We'd like to open it up to those of you who have attended. We've got quite a large group size here, so please throw out questions to us and we will happily answer them in turn. Let's see. Okay, I'll start with one of the earlier questions. Maybe Tom, Mike, anybody on the team jump in. So the question is, given Bangladesh's position, along with critical regional trade and connectivity corridors, what are the key geopolitical risks that could disrupt supply chain, logistics, or cross-border stability in the near future?
I can jump on this one. I don't know if the person who asked the question is a cricket fan, particularly interested in Bangladeshi cricket, but I think that's kind of a key example of the geopolitical risks we've seen in the last few months or so, because we had the T20 World Cup that was co-hosted by India and Sri Lanka, And basically, there was a whole bunch of disruption associated with even just holding the event, primarily because of the geopolitical impact of a major deterioration in India and Bangladesh relations. And that was precipitated by kind of targeted violence, anti-Indian or anti-Hindu violence in Bangladesh, and then anti-Bangladeshi / anti-Muslim violence in parts of India as well. That kind of retaliatory tit for tat. That prompted a deterioration in relations. Bangladesh threatened to boycott the tournament and ended up doing so on the back of that. Now, in terms of how that kind of affects risks on the ground, I think at the time we were concerned about various supply chains, particularly if you're, say, an Indian-based company in Dhaka, for example. We had factories that were targeted, vandalized, there was arson attacks, and of course targeted kind of violence and lynchings of certain workers as well, which highlights that duty of care that you have to protect employees when those sort of risks emerge, but then also what you do with your assets, how you protect those, and then ultimately do you have to relocate? How do you kind of change your posture to align with those deteriorating geopolitical risks? In terms of, say, cross-border movement, the concern as well was, could there be a border shutdown, certainly along the Indian border, for example, on the basis of concerns over I suppose a spillover of violence or something that turns into something even more severe. So that can very quickly, of course, disrupt cross-border movement, trade, and again, the supply chains. As you rightfully pointed out, the region is heavily connected. So I hope that helps in terms of kind of, an example of where those kind of geopolitical risks can really impact Bangladesh and then also other parts of South Asia.
Yeah. Okay, let me just switch to another question, which is a comment and a question. Really interesting session. Just a question about information sources. So this ties back to what I said earlier, finding the signal in the noise. So in particular, to tracking developments in Iran, what source of intelligence sources would you recommend?
Yeah, Chris, I'll jump in on this one, and Mikey, Rani, feel free to add anything. But it's this conflict is particularly interesting purely because in the first few days there was so much, as you said, it's finding information through the noise, and what we've seen, there was a sharp turn a couple of days later when a lot of states involved in the Middle Eastern conflict then really doubled down on censorship. So there was so much that we were getting through in the first, I'd say, 4 days, and then almost nothing coming through afterwards. So we've dealt with both scenarios. We use a whole host of different intelligence sources. So I think the most fundamental ones we view, particularly from this conflict, has been the airspace NOTAMs are really good at showing what's happening. We use a whole host of open source handles on social media platforms that we sweep through. Obviously, some are way more reliable than others. Even the real propaganda heavy sources that we've used have been quite interesting just to see what the rhetoric is and what's likely to happen in relation to that. We saw a lot coming from the IRGC related social media platforms. So it was really interesting to see what they were pushing out. Really interesting to see what the US and Israel were pushing out as well, and then trying to find that balance of what we can believe and what we couldn't. I know this is a very long-winded answer, rather than saying you should go ahead and follow these people for the most up-to-date information, but in reality, everything takes that human verification in order to actually find out what's happening. And we use a whole variety of sources to cross-triangulate that to then try and get to the bottom of what's going on. And we also have ground teams in the region who have that actual knowledge of what's going on. I mean, I was I was touching base with a lot of my contacts back in the UAE, where I grew up. So that was really helpful with seeing what was coming in from the media, and also kind of relaying that and finding what was the actual ground truth. And a lot of it didn't align. So in particular for Iran, Iran closed down very early on. In fact, this is the longest comms blackout they've had in recent history, and this is a marked change from the same thing happened last year in June, but this is just it's lengthened. So it's really hard to find ground truth of what's happening in Iran. But again, it goes back to that cross triangulation of different sources in order to try and work out what's happening and punch through that propaganda and the misinformation that's out there.
Yep. Very important to triangulate, synthesize the information. And again, for those of us of you on the call, it's not just Tom and a few colleagues pulling together and doing this. We have a very robust team that is involved in assessing, analyzing, and then putting out information to our clients. We actually have a dedicated hub on Helix's website to the conflict in the Middle East, where we put out rolling situation reports. This is open to the public. You don't just have to be a client. So feel free to go check that out to have access to information as well. We have quite a few questions coming in. I want to give a shot at answering questions for a few people who haven't asked. So let me go to this one. Buzz question, Helix assessment. What is Helix's assessment regarding the possibility of China making a move on Taiwan over the coming year?
Mikey, were you going to jump in on that one?
I was, but that's all good.
No,
I'll quickly make a point and then can feed off each other. I think overall our assessment is it's unlikely. There are questions about there are multiple questions about China at the moment where we're a bit doubtful that they're ready for any sort of invasion of Taiwan or even willing to risk it, and that's even in the context of the Middle East and a more distracted, disjointed kind of US strategy. One of them is the recent military purges that we've seen in China, or high-ranking purges of kind of military officials. So there's only really two people, including Xi Jinping himself, on one of the main kind of central military commissions there. And one of the kind of high-ranking generals was released from his post in the past month or so. That does call into question kind of the internal cohesion, both within the CCP, but also kind of their confidence, I suppose, with China's military modernization, whether they're ready or not. And ultimately, I think China's more willing to kind of see what happens with Taiwan internally as well. Taiwan has experienced a deterioration in its own cohesion risks, effectively a kind of hung parliament situation, really, with the DPP and KMT there. So I think realistically, the points touched on before about hybrid warfare, I think China is probably more willing to bet, at least for this year, that hybrid pressure can continue to produce results that are favorable to China's interests. Plus, we've got the talks. It'll help in May, I think. We didn't touch on this, but Trump did end up delaying the planned talks with Xi Jinping, which was supposed to be next week, into mid-May. So we should get a better indication as well as to kind of the status of the relationship, and also where Taiwan kind of fits into that, and potentially as well the kind of likelihood of any sort of greater Chinese push towards Taiwan. But I don't know if you had anything else on that, Tom.
No, I think you're exactly right, Mikey. I think you've hit the nail on the head there. Yeah, just to add on, I mean, I think China are very good at playing the long game, and I think they'd be watching how the elections play out in 2028 in Taiwan before they go into any sort of hot conflict before that point. I think it was really interesting a couple of weeks ago where the sorties from Beijing into Taiwanese airspace stopped and halted for a couple of weeks while the US was engaging in the Middle East. And that could mean a variety of different things. But one thing it could potentially signal is that the PLA don't have the resources to conduct Taiwan operations and also monitor what's happening in the Iran Gulf conflict. So that's it's a bit of a speculation, but I think it was interesting to see that dynamic at play. But yeah, I agree. I mean, in terms of our assessment, it would be unlikely that China make a move on Taiwan over the coming year.
Okay.
I think as well, sorry, just to really quickly jump on for slightly more of a shorter term outlook on that. We've spoken a lot about the Middle Eastern conflict having impact on sort of the oil and gas availability. And I think it's important to remain aware that China is not excluded from that. They've internally had their own risks with the access to the oil and gas. And although they are one of the region's main refiners, I think just that sort of operational capacity for them is dwindled a lot more than it would have been sort of pre-conflict. So I think sort of in conjunction with everything else that Tom and Mikey touched on, in terms of any real near-term action, they're facing similar constraints to the rest of the world and do need to prioritize whether right now or sort of the next year or so is going to be the most optimal time for any sort of action of that scale.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Ronnie. We have a lot of questions. We don't have time to get through all of them, but we would like to let you all know that we will take note of these questions. And when we send the video to everybody who registered, we will also include responses to all the questions we were not able to directly address right now. So just kind of in closing, I want to thank firstly all of you who registered, all of you who attended. It's obvious we live in a complex time, pressures on supply chain, disruption, natural disasters, shifting geopolitical alliances, and obviously the ongoing conflict in the Middle East has many, many downstream implications, not just for that part of the world, but also over here in Asia Pacific.